She was barely 19 when her own blood sold her like livestock. But what happened next on that desolate Texas ranch would change everything and everyone forever. The dust swirled thick that scorching afternoon in Dry Creek, Texas, where the sun beat down mercilessly on cracked earth and broken dreams. The heat shimmered off the parched ground like ghostly dancers, creating mirages that promised water where none existed. The air hung heavy and still, thick enough to choke on, carrying the scent of dried grass and desperation. Mabel stood barefoot in the dirty yard of the ramshackle house she'd called home for 19 long years, her calloused hands trembling as she stared at the ground, refusing to meet the eyes of the man who'd come to claim her. The wooden planks of the porch sagged beneath the weight of years and neglect, paint peeling like old skin in the relentless Texas heat. Chickens pecked listlessly in the dust around her feet, their feathers dull and lifeless in the oppressive atmosphere. Her father, Cletus, was a man weathered by whiskey and resentment, his face carved deep with lines of disappointment and bitterness. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, stained with sweat and the remnants of countless bottles. He'd never wanted a daughter. Never wanted her. The very sight of Mabel seemed to remind him of every failure, every dream that had withered and died in this godforsaken place. In his twisted mind, women were burdens, mouths to feed with no real purpose except cooking and cleaning, existing only to serve the men who owned them. Never wanted a girl in this house, Cletus spat, his voice cutting through the oppressive heat like a rusty blade drawn across stone. His bloodshot eyes held no warmth, no paternal love, only the cold calculation of a man who saw his own flesh and blood as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. Women ain't good for nothing but keeping house and birthing sons. I needed a boy to work this land, not some delicate flower who can't even lift a hay bale without whimpering. The words hit Mabel like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of her worthlessness in his eyes. She'd heard variations of this speech her entire life, but today it carried the weight of finality, the crushing certainty that her fate was being decided without her voice, without her consent. Across from him stood Jeremiah, a tall rancher with shoulders broad as a barn door and eyes cold as winter stone. His weathered hands hung at his sides, steady and unmoving as he listened to Cletus's cruel words without flinching. There was something imposing about his stillness, a quiet authority that spoke of a man accustomed to command. His clothes were well-made but practical, the attire of a successful man who worked with his hands. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but Mabel could feel the weight of his gaze even without meeting his eyes. "I'm selling this girl for a prize bull and $50, Cletus continued, his voice harsh with finality, each word dropping like stones into still water. "Can't afford to keep feeding dead weight. You take her, and we're square on what I owe you. She's young enough to learn, strong enough to work, and she won't give you no trouble." Inside the house, Mabel's mother, Cordelia, wept quietly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to echo through the thin walls. She pressed a worn handkerchief to her mouth, trying to muffle the sounds of her grief. She had tried to intervene earlier, had begged Cletus to reconsider, but his fist had already silenced her protests. The bruise on her jaw was still fresh, a purple reminder of her powerlessness in this household, where women's voices carried no weight. Jeremiah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he was affected by the scene unfolding before him. This wasn't just business, it was cruelty of the basest kind. But his reputation in these parts demanded he show no emotion, no weakness. He was known as a hard man, fair but unforgiving, and that reputation had served him well in building his empire from nothing. "Deal's a deal," he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless as the Texas plains. "But understand this, I expect work, not tears. I don't tolerate laziness or self-pity. You earn your keep, or you find yourself back where you came from." The wagon ride to Jeremiah's ranch stretched endlessly across the Texas plains, the silence between them thick as molasses and twice as suffocating. Mabel sat rigid beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She clutched her few possessions, a worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, a faded photograph of her mother as a young woman, and the simple dress she wore, as if they were lifelines to a world that was rapidly disappearing behind them. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of horse hooves against the hard-packed earth and the creak of worn leather as the wagon swayed with each rut in the road. The landscape rolled by in endless waves of brown grass and scattered mesquite trees, broken only by the occasional windmill spinning lazily in the hot breeze. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows passing over the wagon like dark omens. When they finally reached the ranch after what felt like hours of torturous silence, Mabel's breath caught in her throat. It was vast beyond her imagination. Thousands of acres of rolling grassland dotted with cattle, enclosed by endless miles of fence that seemed to stretch to the very horizon. The main house was solid and imposing, built from rough-hewn timber that had weathered decades of storms and seasons. It spoke of permanence, of success, of a life so far removed from her own experience that it might as well have been a palace. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, a massive barn that could house dozens of horses, corrals filled with cattle, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and various sheds and storage buildings that spoke of a working operation on a scale she'd never imagined. The whole place hummed with activity and purpose, a stark contrast to the dying farm she'd left behind. Jeremiah climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease and waited for her to follow, his face an unreadable mask carved from stone. "This is how it works here," he said, his tone brooking no argument, each word delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "You pull your weight, or you find yourself back where you came from. No exceptions. No second chances. No excuses." But as Mabel stood there, small and vulnerable in the shadow of that massive ranch, feeling like a sparrow in a land of eagles, a young man emerged from the barn. This was Tobias, Jeremiah's son, barely older than Mabel herself, with kind eyes the color of summer sky and a gentle smile that seemed to soften the harsh edges of this place. Where his father was all sharp angles and hard lines, Tobias possessed a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. "Welcome to the Double J," Tobias said warmly, tipping his hat with genuine courtesy. "I hope you'll find some happiness here, miss. This place can be hard, but it can also be good to those who give it a chance." For the first time since leaving her mother's house, Mabel felt a flicker of hope kindle in her chest, like a small flame in the darkness. The first weeks nearly broke her spirit and her body. Mabel woke before dawn each day, her muscles aching from unfamiliar labor that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The work was relentless and unforgiving, milking cows whose udders seemed perpetually full, hauling water from the well in buckets that grew heavier with each step, tending the vegetable garden under the merciless sun, scrubbing floors until her knees bled and her hands were raw. The Texas sun showed no mercy, beating down on her fair skin until it burned and peeled, leaving her looking like a molting snake. Her hands, once soft despite her humble origins, became calloused and cracked, the skin splitting in places that stung with every movement. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but rest was a luxury she couldn't afford in this new world, where her worth was measured solely by her productivity. Jeremiah watched her struggle with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock at market. When she stumbled carrying water buckets, sloshing precious liquid onto the thirsty ground, he didn't help, just watched with those steel-gray eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it all wanting. When she burned the cornbread, filling the kitchen with acrid smoke, he ate it without comment, but his disapproval filled the room like a thundercloud ready to burst. "You're slower than winter molasses," he'd growl when she took too long with the milking, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Back where I come from, we'd have had you replaced by now." But Mabel refused to break, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Something deep inside her, a stubbornness she'd inherited from her mother's side, a core of steel wrapped in velvet, kept her going when everything else wanted to quit. She learned to milk the cows without spilling a drop, to carry water without stopping to rest, to cook meals that filled the bellies of hard-working men without complaint. What she didn't know was that Jeremiah had begun to notice her determination with something approaching respect. He saw how she bit her lip when frustrated, but never complained aloud. How she helped Tobias with his chores without being asked, bringing him water when he worked in the heat. How she hummed softly while working, filling the house with something it had lacked for years. The sound of contentment, of a woman's presence that transformed a house into something approaching a home. One particularly brutal morning, as Mabel struggled with a stubborn cow named Bertha, who seemed determined to kick over the milk bucket, Jeremiah appeared at her side like a shadow given substance. Without a word, he placed his large, work-roughened hands over hers, guiding her movements with surprising gentleness. "Like this," he said gruffly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, carrying an undertone of something that might have been kindness. Firm, but gentle. "She's got to trust you before she'll give you what you need." The warmth of his hands, the unexpected kindness in his voice, sent something electric through Mabel's entire being. For just a moment, the wall between them cracked, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the armor of indifference. "Thank you," she whispered, not daring to look up at him, afraid that meeting his eyes might shatter this fragile moment of connection. Jeremiah stepped back quickly, as if burned by the contact. "Don't read anything into it," he said harshly, the walls slamming back into place. "Just don't want you ruining good milk." But Mabel had seen something in his eyes. A flicker of the man beneath the armor, a glimpse of vulnerability that he tried so hard to hide. Summer melted into autumn like honey from a jar, and with it came a subtle shift in the rhythm of ranch life. The oppressive heat gave way to cooler mornings and evenings, painted in shades of gold and crimson. Mabel had found her place in the daily routine, but more than that, she'd begun to find moments of unexpected joy in this harsh landscape. She discovered that Tobias had a quick wit and a gentle heart that reminded her of everything good in the world. During their evening chores, he would tell her stories about his mother, Rebecca, who had died when he was barely 10, leaving Jeremiah to raise him alone in a world that had suddenly become much colder and lonelier. "Father wasn't always so hard," Tobias confided one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Mother's death, it changed him, closed him off like a flower in winter. He loved her something fierce, and when she died, birthing my little sister who didn't make it either, something in him just broke." Mabel began to understand the pain behind Jeremiah's coldness, the grief that had hardened his heart like winter ground. She noticed how he'd pause outside Tobias's room at night, as if wanting to say goodnight, but not knowing how to bridge the gap that loss had created between them. How he'd set aside the choicest pieces of meat for his son without comment, small gestures of love that he couldn't voice. How his eyes would soften when he thought no one was watching, revealing depths of feeling he kept carefully hidden. When she learned that Jeremiah's birthday was approaching, information gleaned from casual conversation with Tobias, Mabel made a decision that would change everything. She spent days planning in secret, gathering ingredients from the garden and the pantry, preparing a feast that would speak the words she couldn't say aloud. The evening of his birthday, Jeremiah returned from the range to find the main room transformed beyond recognition. Wildflowers from the meadow, Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and black-eyed Susans graced the rough wooden table in mason jars that caught the light like jewels. Candles flickered warmly in the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was rich with the sense of pot roast, fresh bread, and apple pie, aromas that spoke of home and comfort and care. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, but Mabel could see the surprise and something deeper, perhaps longing, flickering in his eyes. "It's your birthday," Mabel said simply, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. I thought you deserved to be celebrated." Jeremiah sat down slowly, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over the fine china that had belonged to his late wife, dishes that hadn't seen use since Rebecca's death. He ate in silence, but Mabel could see the emotion working in his throat, the way his jaw tightened as if he were fighting back words or tears. "This is," he began, then stopped, struggling with words that seemed too big for his mouth. "This is very good." Coming from Jeremiah, it was practically poetry. As the evening wore on and the candles burned lower, The walls between them began to crumble like ancient fortifications finally surrendering to time. Jeremiah spoke of his childhood, of the father who'd shown him more belt than love, the head who'd taught him that emotions were weakness and tenderness was a luxury real men couldn't afford. He told her about Rebecca, his young wife who died bringing Tobias into the world, and the guilt and grief that had hardened his heart like winter ground. "I never learned how to be gentle," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, each word pulled from him like a splinter from deep wood. "Never learned how to love without losing everything that matters." Mabel reached across the table, her small hand covering his scarred one, feeling the calluses and old wounds that told the story of a life lived through hard work and harder losses. "You're not alone anymore," she said simply, the words carrying more weight than any grand declaration. The silence that followed was different, charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken promises, and the fragile hope of new beginnings. Spring arrived, with a burst of wildflowers and new beginnings, painting the landscape in colors that seemed impossible after the long gray winter. The ice between Jeremiah and Mabel had thawed completely, replaced by something tender and precious, a love that grew slowly, steadily, like the strongest roots that anchor the mightiest trees. Jeremiah began teaching Mabel to ride, his hands steady on her waist as he helped her into the saddle of a gentle mare named Daisy. They'd ride out across the vast expanse of the ranch, the wind whipping through her hair as she laughed with pure joy, a sound that seemed to heal something broken in Jeremiah's chest. The freedom of movement, the partnership with the horse, the endless sky above. It all combined to make Mabel feel truly alive for the first time in her life. One perfect afternoon, when the air was sweet with the scent of blooming mesquite and the sky was the color of forget-me-nots, Jeremiah led her to a hidden valley where a waterfall cascaded into a crystal-clear pool. Ancient oak trees provided shade, their branches forming a natural cathedral that seemed to hold the very essence of peace. "This was my secret place as a boy," he told her, his voice soft with memory, "where I came to escape the world when it got too heavy to bear." They sat by the water's edge on a blanket he'd brought, sharing their deepest fears and dreams like precious gifts. Mabel told him about the loneliness of her childhood, the father who'd never shown her love, the constant feeling of being unwanted and unwelcome in her own home. Jeremiah spoke of his terror of loving again, of losing again, of the way grief could hollow out a man until he was nothing but an empty shell, going through the motions of living. "I don't know how to love anymore," he confessed, his voice breaking like a dam finally giving way to the flood. "I'm afraid I've forgotten how." "Then we'll learn together," Mabel whispered, her hand finding his cheek, feeling the roughness of his beard and the warmth of his skin. When he kissed her, it was with all the tenderness he'd held back for so long, all the love he'd been afraid to feel. It was a kiss that spoke of forever, of home, of hearts finally finding their match after years of searching in the darkness. Later, as they prepared to leave their secret place, Jeremiah presented her with a small apple sapling, its roots wrapped carefully in burlap. "For us to plant together," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to grow with our love. Maybe someday our children will play in its shade." Mabel's tears fell like rain on the small tree, but they were tears of joy, of hope, of a future she'd never dared to imagine. 2 years passed like seasons changing, each one bringing new growth, new joy, new reasons to believe in second chances and the power of love to transform even the most wounded hearts. The ranch that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of a family learning to love. Mabel had blossomed into a confident woman, her voice now heard in every decision, her presence felt in every corner of the house. She'd transformed the ranch into a home, filled with warmth and the promise of tomorrow. The apple tree they'd planted together had grown tall and strong, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms embracing the future. When Jeremiah proposed, it was beneath that same apple tree, now tall enough to provide shade for their wedding ceremony. He knelt in the dappled sunlight, his weathered hands trembling as he offered her a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Tobias stood as his father's best man, tears streaming down his face as he watched 2 wounded souls pledge their lives to each other. The ceremony was simple but profound, attended by ranch hands and neighbors who had watched this unlikely love story unfold. "I promise to love you not just today, but every day for the rest of our lives," Jeremiah vowed, his voice strong and sure. "In sickness and health, in good times and bad, until my last breath leaves my body." In the middle of the celebration, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the gathering. Cordelia, Mabel's mother, stood hesitantly in her finest dress, her face lined with years of sorrow, but her eyes bright with hope and the possibility of redemption. "Mama," Mabel cried, running to embrace her, feeling like a child again in her mother's arms. "Your father's gone," Cordelia whispered, her voice carrying both grief and relief. "Died of his own bitterness and the bottle that was his only companion. I've sold the old place. I'm starting fresh, just like you." The reunion was bittersweet, a closing of old wounds and the opening of new possibilities, proof that it's never too late to begin again. A year later, as autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Mabel gave birth to their first child, a son they named Daniel, after Jeremiah's grandfather, but with the promise that this Daniel would know only love from the moment he drew his first breath. Jeremiah held his newborn son with trembling hands, tears streaming down his weathered face as he marveled at the tiny fingers and perfect features. "This boy will know what love feels like from day one," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "He'll never wonder if he's wanted, never doubt that he belongs." As Mabel watched her husband cradle their child, she marveled at the transformation. The cold, bitter man who'd bought her like cattle had become the most devoted father and husband she could have imagined. Love had worked its magic, healing wounds that had seemed too deep to ever mend. The ranch was alive now with the sounds of family. Tobias teaching his baby brother to walk, Cordelia sharing stories on the porch, Jeremiah singing lullabies in his rough voice that somehow made them more beautiful than any trained singer could manage. The apple tree had grown tall and strong, its branches providing shade for picnics and its fruit sweet enough to make the finest pies. Sometimes when the sun set over the Texas plains and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Mabel would stand on the porch and remember the frightened girl who'd arrived here with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of fear. That girl had become a woman, a wife, a mother, but more than that, she'd become the heart of everything good in this place. The woman who'd been sold like livestock had become the foundation upon which a family was built. The man who'd sworn off love had found it again in the most unlikely place. And the ranch that had once been a prison had become a sanctuary. Proof that even the most wounded hearts can heal when they find their home. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the darkest chapters. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most lead us to those who will love us the best. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to plant our roots in unexpected soil, we discover that home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to love us day after day for the rest of our lives. In the end, Mabel learned that being sold wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of everything beautiful that was yet to come.